Okay, moving on to Portland Place Special Policy Area. Should we maintain the long-standing approach to protect all institutional uses in this area, or should there be any exceptions to this approach? Could someone just explain what the institutional uses are?
Yes, well, institutional uses, they're on the list, aren't they, of central London activities. Often trade unions, they're sort of offices which have, the headquarters of, say, the RIBA or the RTPI, and they're buildings which offer more than just offices. They are, say, library functions, support facilities for the members of various organisations and bodies, and historically have been in that area for some time.
Okay. Are there any comments about our long-standing protection of those uses? Any concerns with that approach, or should we continue it intact? Any views?
Forgive me commenting on all these things. Just a quick comment on this one. My concern is this will go the way of all the other ones. Belgrave Square was one of these for 40 years, and eventually the institutions couldn't stay in the buildings anymore. They were Grade 1 listed, and all those foundations, the Royal Colleges, heaps of them moved out and ended up with something like 20% vacancy in Belgrave Square, and eventually, after a lot of argument, the policy was lifted. We had the same thing happen in Queen Anne Street. We had the same thing happen in Gloucester Place. And my concern is that we need to check this really as a sustainable policy in the long term, because the evidence is elsewhere that ultimately, particularly tied into head leases, actually, they're not. So I think one needs to just check. I have a different view to the Harley Street point on this one, and certainly I think we need to look very closely at the boundaries and the users and whether it's real, because actually we know from the past that it hasn't worked, because the occupiers then have to move anyway.
Okay, thank you.
I'd just like to add to that. We've been involved advising some of the institutions in Portland Place. They're very expensive buildings to live in, to maintain, the listed nature of it. And a lot of these occupiers are wanting much simpler space, more open plan offices, and perhaps sharing facilities of conference centres and places where their members can meet. So I think this is at risk, and I think one needs to look at a more flexible approach to some of these houses.
And would that more flexible approach include, say, taking the policy approach for losses, as we've got in the third bullet point here about long-term vacancy, or would you suggest a different approach to it?
Well, I think flexibility to other uses. I mean, obviously residential would be an obvious other use. There are a limited number of uses. Clubs, these buildings are very expensive, and they can be quite restored to the original use, which may have been family houses in the first place.
And do you have any views on long-term vacancy, whether or not we should apply that as a criteria before we would allow it to change to these other uses?
I would suggest once they fall out of use, unless there's another institution that wishes to come forward fairly early on, but then there'll be pricing involved in that. I would suggest the use is looked at quite early.
Thank you.
I think it's more, if I can just say, I think it's more important to know at the outset, and I'd be interested to know what is causing these perceived problems, rather than us waiting, as we classically do, for somewhere to lay fallow for ages to evidence that failure, and what we can do as a planning authority to, if there is anything we can do, to allow that. So taking the Harley Street example there, if we're more flexible on conservation issues there, to allow some of those things that Councillor Nemeth was talking about to be knocked through to make better clinics, well, is there something we could be doing here? Because to my mind, I would like the REBA and others to be remaining in those areas. I think it gives that kind of character to it. So I think as a city council, we should be trying to do all we can to be flexible at the outset to encourage those uses and let them stay.
Can I help you there? Because again, it's my ward, so I know it intimately. I hear what is said about them being, but I don't know of any particular building down there that's empty at the moment, as it has been empty for any period of time. The RAF Benevolent Fund, for example, are carrying out a major refurbishment. And again, because our planners have been actually quite sensible and cooperative in terms of what can be done inside without affecting the exterior approach, they have decided, is my understanding, to stay there and to carry this wonderful redevelopment internally out, which is basically levelling out floors and putting them so you've got a larger floor plate and knocking some walls down to make that happen. And indeed, I think it was the psychiatrist or psychoanalyst, or I can't remember, on the other side of the road, exactly the same thing happened. So I think the point being made is that there should be a degree of flexibility and assistance from the council to make sure these things can happen. That is happening at the moment with our officers and with the occupiers. And I would be very sad if we lost those uses to something other than perhaps residential. But having said that, how many people would want one of these houses to live in? They are quite large, quite enormous, and difficult to maintain by an individual family. So that could create its own problems. And what we wouldn't want is the situation we had around the corner in Queen Anne Street, has been referred to, Chandler's House, which remained empty for 15 to 20 years or whatever it was, because nobody would take the responsibility on, and compulsory purchase and all sorts of threats and whatever had to happen. And eventually a medical facility was put in terms of the doctor's head office, if I can call it that. So I think providing we've got a degree of flexibility and a degree of understanding from us as a council, then I'd prefer it remains as it is, but just bearing that in mind.
Okay, any further? I mean, in bullet point 2, there's a differentiation here between other institutional uses and diplomatic and allied uses, and it's suggesting that those diplomatic and allied uses, such as, embassies and those sorts of things, sort of play a second tier in our consideration, so that our first priority is the protection of these other institutional uses, such as REBA and those organisations, and that... And that diplomatic and allied uses don't share the same standing within that special policy area. Is there any comment on the relationship with diplomatic and allied uses? Any support for them in the area? Does anyone consider they're part of the character and nature of the area, or do people feel that they're not really?
Well, when you see the demonstrations outside the Chinese embassy, then perhaps you say no. But I think that's part of the colour of London, and it's part of democracy. What they exercise there is a damn nuisance sometimes. But having said that, there are about 5 diplomatic buildings there, including the Turkish ambassador's house, and Swedish, I think, have their house there as well. So, I mean, it's part of the colour of Portland Place. It's part of what makes it.
And would you give them equal standing with other institutional uses, or a lesser standing?
No, I put it on the same level.
Okay, thank you. Any other views on the diplomatic and allied uses? Okay, and any other comments on Portland Place special policy